The child had already sent 26 nannies away before I knocked on the front gate. I didn't know that when I stepped off the city bus with a borrowed coat and $23 left in my checking account. All I knew was that I needed a job. Badly. The November wind cut through my clothes as I stood across the street from the Romano estate, staring at iron gates taller than any building I had ever lived in. Rain drizzled from a gray sky, collecting on the shoulders of my coat, while luxury cars rolled past the security entrance without stopping. I tightened my grip on my canvas bag and reminded myself to breathe. My name is Grace Miller, and at 24 years old, I had cleaned hotel rooms, washed dishes, folded laundry, and mopped floors in buildings where nobody bothered to learn my name. But losing my apartment 2 weeks earlier had changed something inside me. Pride became a luxury I could no longer afford. The listing had sounded simple enough. Live-in maid. Excellent pay. Private residence. Immediate start. I expected an elderly billionaire or a celebrity who hated dust. I did not expect the Romano family. The guard at the gate studied my ID before speaking into an earpiece. A moment later, the gates slowly opened. Even then, I considered turning around. The driveway stretched nearly a quarter mile, winding through perfectly trimmed hedges and towering trees wrapped in white lights. The mansion itself looked less like a home and more like something from an old movie. Stone walls, massive windows, columns reaching toward the clouds. Everything about it whispered power. The housekeeper who greeted me introduced herself as Mrs. Carter. She looked exhausted, not tired, defeated, the kind of exhaustion that settled deep in a person's bones. She led me through marble hallways that echoed beneath our footsteps. Expensive paintings lined the walls. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Yet despite all the beauty, something felt wrong. The house was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Lonely quiet. The kind that follows after laughter disappears. We stopped outside a sitting room. Mrs. Carter folded her hands together and sighed. "Before you meet Mr. Romano," she said, "there's something you should know." Her expression softened. "You are nanny number 27. I blinked. I thought I was applying to be a maid. "You are," she replied. "But the position always becomes something more." My stomach tightened. What happened to the others? She glanced toward the staircase. His son happened. A distant sound echoed from upstairs. Something small hitting the floor. Then silence. "The child doesn't speak," she continued quietly. "Hasn't for almost 2 years." I wasn't sure what to say. And every nanny? Gone within days. A strange feeling settled over me. Not fear. Curiosity. Before I could ask another question, a sharp crash sounded from the second floor. Mrs. Carter closed her eyes for a moment as if she had heard that same noise 100 times before. That would be Ethan. The name lingered in the air. Ethan Romano. The little boy nobody could reach. The child who kept sending people away. Somewhere upstairs, another object fell. Then silence returned. Heavy. Waiting. Almost as if the entire mansion was holding its breath. And for reasons I still can't explain, I had this sudden feeling that the moment Ethan Romano looked at me, my life would never be the same again. I expected to meet Ethan that afternoon. Instead, I spent nearly 2 hours learning the rules. Mrs. Carter walked me through the mansion while a younger staff member carried my single suitcase upstairs. Every room looked perfect. Every surface gleamed. Every detail seemed carefully controlled. Yet the tension was impossible to miss. It lived in the way people lowered their voices. It lingered in the quick glances they exchanged whenever the little boy upstairs was mentioned. By the time we reached the kitchen, I had heard the same warning 4 different times. Do not force him to talk. Do not touch his belongings. Do not raise your voice. Most importantly, do not make him cry. I sat quietly at the large wooden table while Mrs. Carter poured coffee into a white mug. Her hands trembled slightly. "The first nanny lasted 3 weeks," she said. "The second lasted 10 days. After that, they usually leave much faster." "Why?" I asked. She looked toward the ceiling. "Because they think they can fix him." The answer stayed with me long after she left the room. Around 4 o'clock, another staff member escorted me to the second floor. My heart pounded harder with every step. At the end of a long hallway stood a closed door painted dark blue. A small toy truck rested outside it. Nobody spoke. The staff member simply nodded toward the door and left. Suddenly, I was alone. I stood there for several seconds listening. Nothing. No television. No music. No laughter. Just silence. Finally, I knocked gently. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. Taking a slow breath, I pushed the door open. The room surprised me. For a child, it felt strangely untouched. Shelves filled with books. Toys lined up neatly against one wall. A small bed near the window. Everything organized. Everything quiet. Ethan sat on the floor beside the bed. He looked younger than I expected. Small for 4 years old. Dark brown hair. Pale skin. A gray sweater slightly too large for his frame. He was building something with wooden blocks. Or at least pretending to. Most of the pieces sat untouched around him. His eyes never lifted from the floor when I entered. "Hi," I said softly. "My name is Grace." No reaction. I smiled anyway. I am not very good at introductions, but I figured I should try. Silence. I noticed a coloring book on a nearby chair. A stuffed fox tucked beside a pillow. Little signs of a child hidden beneath layers of sadness. Slowly, I stepped farther into the room. Ethan immediately picked up a block and dropped it onto the floor with a loud clack. Not an accident. A warning. I stopped moving. His gaze remained fixed downward. Another block followed. Then another. Each one striking the hardwood floor. Message received. Do not come closer. For some reason, I was not offended. If anything, my chest hurt a little. This was not anger. This was a fortress. A very small boy guarding himself the only way he knew how. "Okay," I said quietly. "I can sit over here." I lowered myself into a chair near the wall, several feet away, far enough to respect the boundary he had drawn. Minutes passed. Then more. Neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the window. Somewhere downstairs, a clock chimed the hour. Ethan continued staring at the floor. I continued sitting quietly. Eventually, he lifted his eyes for the first time. Only for a second, just long enough to look at me. Then he looked away again. But that single glance felt important. Because hidden inside those green eyes was not anger. Not even distrust. It was loneliness. Deep, heartbreaking loneliness. And for the first time since arriving at the Romano estate, I began to understand that this job was never about cleaning rooms or following rules. It was about reaching a child who had stopped letting the world reach him. I spent the next 3 days learning the rhythm of the mansion. Every morning, I helped Mrs. Carter organize the household. Every afternoon, I sat quietly in Ethan's room. And every evening, I wondered why I had not been sent away yet. The answer was simple. Unlike the others, I was not trying to change him. I was just showing up. Ethan still did not speak. He rarely looked at me for more than a second or two. Most of our time passed in silence. Sometimes he sat on the floor with his blocks. Sometimes he stared out the window at the gardens below. Occasionally, he would leave the room without warning, and I would simply follow from a respectful distance. Little by little, I began noticing things. He always carried the same small silver key in his pocket. He refused to let anyone make his bed. And every night before dinner, he disappeared into his room for exactly 10 minutes and locked the door. The behavior puzzled me. Children usually hid toys or candy. Ethan seemed to be protecting something much more important. On the 4th afternoon, rain tapped softly against the windows while gray clouds rolled across the sky. Ethan sat cross-legged on the rug, drawing with crayons. For nearly an hour, he remained focused on the page. Then Mrs. Carter called me downstairs to sign some paperwork. I was gone less than 15 minutes. When I returned, Ethan was gone. The room was empty. At first I assumed he had wandered into another part of the house. Then I noticed something unusual. One of the crayons had rolled beneath the bed. I knelt to retrieve it. The moment I reached under the frame, my fingers brushed against something unexpected. A wooden box. Small. Worn around the edges. Hidden carefully against the wall. My first instinct was to leave it alone. Every rule in the house warned against touching Ethan's belongings. But something about the box stopped me. It was old. Much older than the toys around it. Almost trembling with curiosity, I slid it forward just enough to see the top. A faded blue ribbon wrapped around it. Nothing more. Before I could move it back, a sharp breath sounded behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned. Ethan stood in the doorway. His face had gone pale. His green eyes locked onto the box. For a moment, neither of us moved. Panic flashed across his expression. Not anger. Fear. Deep fear. The kind that made my heart ache instantly. I pushed the box back exactly where I had found it and stood up slowly. "I am sorry," I said. I dropped a crayon. Ethan stared at me. His small chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, without looking away, he crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside the bed. Carefully, almost reverently, He reached underneath and pulled the box into his lap. His fingers rested on the lid. The room felt impossibly quiet. I could tell whatever was inside mattered more than anything else in the world to him. Then something happened that nobody had prepared me for. Ethan looked directly into my eyes. Not for 1 second. Not for 2. He held my gaze. And for the first time since I arrived, he allowed me to see the sadness he had been hiding. Slowly, he opened the box. Inside the box sat a photograph, a small music box, and a pressed white flower so fragile it looked as though it might crumble if touched. Ethan held the box tightly against his chest while his eyes remained fixed on me. I stayed perfectly still. The photograph had slipped slightly sideways, allowing me to glimpse a smiling woman with dark hair and kind eyes. Even without being told, I knew who she was. His mother. Suddenly everything made sense. The silence. The loneliness. The walls he had built around himself. This was not a child refusing the world. This was a child afraid of losing the last pieces of someone he loved. Ethan carefully lifted the photograph. His small fingers traced the edge of it, as though he had done so 1,000 times before. The room felt sacred, like a place where grief had quietly taken root and refused to leave. I lowered myself into the chair again and kept my voice gentle. She looks beautiful. Ethan did not answer. I had not expected him to, but he did not look away either. Instead, he studied my face, searching for something. Maybe judgment, maybe pity, maybe disappointment. Whatever he was expecting, I hoped he did not find it. After a few moments, he reached into the box and pulled out the music box. It was old and scratched, the paint worn away in several places. One corner appeared slightly damaged. He turned the tiny key on the side. Nothing happened. He tried again. Still nothing. The disappointment that crossed his face was so brief most people would have missed it. I did not. His shoulders sank ever so slightly. He stared at the silent music box as though waiting for a miracle. Then, very carefully, he placed it back inside. My heart squeezed. "It is broken?" I asked softly. His eyes flickered toward me. Then he gave the smallest nod. The first direct response he had ever given me. A nod. Tiny. Barely noticeable. Yet it felt enormous. I smiled before I could stop myself. "Thank you for telling me." Ethan blinked. For a second, genuine confusion appeared on his face. As if nobody had ever thanked him for something so simple. The rain outside grew heavier. Water slid down the windows in silver trails. Somewhere downstairs, a door opened and closed. The world continued moving. But inside that room, something had shifted. Ethan slowly pushed the music box toward me across the rug. Then he stopped. His hand remained resting on top of it. Hesitating. Unsure. I understood immediately. Trust was not given all at once. It arrived in pieces. Tiny fragile pieces. Just like that flower inside the box. "Would you like me to look at it?" I asked. He stared at the music box for several seconds. Then at me. Finally, he released it. I carefully picked it up. The metal key felt loose. The hinge seemed stuck. Nothing impossible. My grandfather used to repair old clocks when I was a little girl. I had spent countless afternoons handing him tools while he explained how small things could be fixed if someone had enough patience. "I cannot promise," I said honestly, "but I can try." For the first time since I had entered the Romano estate, a faint spark appeared in Ethan's eyes. Not happiness. Not yet. Hope. And somehow, that felt even more important. I spent most of that evening at the kitchen table with the music box resting beside a lamp while rain continued tapping against the windows. The mansion had grown quiet. Staff members moved through the hallways in hushed voices, and somewhere upstairs Ethan was waiting. That knowledge stayed with me. He was waiting. Not for dinner. Not for bedtime. For me. The realization felt strangely heavy. I carefully loosened a tiny screw on the side of the music box and opened the mechanism. One of the gears had slipped out of place. Nothing serious. Just enough to stop the melody from playing. Nearly 40 minutes later, I turned the key. At first there was only silence. Then a soft note drifted into the room. Another followed. A delicate melody filled the air. Simple, gentle, beautiful. I smiled immediately. The next morning, I carried the repaired music box upstairs. Ethan was sitting beside the window when I entered. Gray clouds stretched across the horizon, casting silver light over the room. His eyes lifted the moment he saw the box in my hands. I sat down on the rug and placed it carefully between us. Neither of us spoke. I slowly turned the key. The first notes floated through the room. Ethan froze. Completely froze. His eyes widened as the melody continued playing. For a second, I thought he might cry. Instead, he moved closer. Not much, just a few inches. But it was the closest he had ever willingly come to me. He stared at the music box as though a piece of the past had suddenly returned. Then something happened that took my breath away. The corners of his mouth lifted. Barely. A tiny smile. Small enough that most people would never notice it. But I noticed. And so did someone else. A shadow moved near the doorway. I looked up. A tall man stood there watching us. Dark hair. Sharp features. Gray suit tailored perfectly. Eyes the color of a storm just before rain. Damien Romano. For several seconds, nobody moved. Ethan immediately looked down, his smile disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Yet Damien remained standing in the doorway, silent, almost stunned. His gaze shifted from his son to the music box and finally to me. There was something unexpected in his expression. Not suspicion, not authority, pain. The kind that lingers long after a person learns how to hide it. That song, he said quietly. His voice was deep and controlled. His mother used to play it every night. The room felt smaller suddenly, more personal. I looked down at the music box. It only needed a small repair. Damien nodded once. His eyes never left Ethan. For the first time, I saw something beyond the powerful reputation everyone whispered about downstairs. I saw a father standing in a doorway, watching his son smile for the first time in years. Ethan slowly reached for the music box and held it against his chest. Then he looked at me. Just for a moment. But this time there was no fear in his eyes. No warning. No walls. Only trust beginning to take shape. And when I glanced back toward the doorway, I realized Damien had seen it too. I began noticing changes after that day. Small changes. Quiet changes. The kind that could easily be missed if you were not paying attention. Ethan started waiting for me in the mornings. I would open the door to his room and find him already sitting beside the window with the music box in his lap. Sometimes he would be holding a book, sometimes a drawing. Once, he simply handed me a green crayon before returning to his coloring page. None of it seemed remarkable to anyone else. To me, it felt like progress. To the staff downstairs, it felt like a miracle. Mrs. Carter nearly dropped a tray one afternoon when Ethan followed me into the kitchen. The little boy had not willingly entered that room in over a year. Yet there he was, standing quietly beside me while I washed strawberries. He did not speak. He did not smile. But he stayed. "I do not believe this," Mrs. Carter whispered. Neither did I. Over the following week, Ethan slowly became part of my daily routine. We walked through the gardens after breakfast. We read stories in the library during rainy afternoons. We spent evenings listening to the repaired music box while the sun disappeared beyond the trees. Through it all, Damien watched. Not constantly, not obviously, but I always sensed him nearby. Sometimes he stood at the far end of a hallway. Sometimes he appeared in the doorway for a few moments before leaving again. The first time we spoke alone happened late one evening. I had just finished organizing a stack of books in the library when his voice startled me from across the room. "You are the first person he has trusted since his mother died." I turned and found Damien standing near the fireplace. The flames cast soft golden light across his face. Without the sharp suits and formal meetings, he looked different somehow. More tired. More human. "I do not think I did anything special," I admitted. His gaze remained steady. "That is exactly why." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The crackling fire filled the silence. Then Damien walked toward one of the shelves and picked up a framed photograph. I recognized the woman immediately. Ethan's mother. The same smile from the photograph hidden inside the wooden box. "Her name was Olivia," he said quietly. "She could walk into any room and make people feel safe." There was no hesitation in his voice. Only love and loss. I looked at the photograph again. Suddenly, I understood why Ethan protected those memories so fiercely. They were all he had left. "He misses her every day," I said softly. Damien lowered his eyes. "So do I." The honesty in those 3 words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I saw the truth hiding beneath everything else. Ethan was not the only one grieving inside this house. The entire mansion carried traces of her absence. The silence, the loneliness, the sadness woven into every hallway. They were all mourning the same person. The next afternoon, another unexpected moment arrived. Ethan and I were sitting beneath a large oak tree in the garden. I was reading aloud from a storybook while he turned the pages. Suddenly, he shifted closer. then closer again. Before I realized what was happening, his small hand slipped into mine. My breath caught instantly. Ethan did not look at me. He simply held on, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Across the lawn, I noticed Damien standing near the terrace. He had seen it. His expression softened in a way I had never witnessed before. And for the first time since arriving at the Romano estate, I realized something important. I had come here believing I needed a job. What I had actually found was a family learning how to breathe again. The following week felt different. Warmer somehow. The mansion no longer seemed like a place frozen in time. Small changes appeared everywhere. Ethan began leaving his room more often. He spent breakfast at the dining table instead of eating alone upstairs. He sat beside me during afternoon reading sessions. Once, he even helped Mrs. Carter water flowers in the greenhouse, earning tears from the older woman when she thought nobody was watching. Hope had returned to the Romano estate, and everyone could feel it. Then one morning, everything changed. I woke to unusual activity throughout the house. Staff members hurried through hallways. Security personnel moved in and out of rooms carrying folders and speaking quietly into earpieces. Something important was happening. I found Mrs. Carter arranging flowers in the front foyer. Her worried expression immediately caught my attention. "What is going on?" I asked. She hesitated. "Business guests." The answer sounded simple, but her voice suggested otherwise. By lunchtime, expensive cars lined the circular driveway. Men and women in tailored clothing filled meeting rooms throughout the mansion. I stayed upstairs with Ethan, determined to keep his day normal. We spent the afternoon building a castle from wooden blocks in the playroom. For nearly an hour, he seemed relaxed. Then a loud burst of laughter echoed from downstairs. Ethan froze. One block slipped from his hand. His shoulders immediately tensed. The old fear returned to his eyes. My heart sank. Progress was fragile. Sometimes all it took was one unexpected moment to remind someone of their pain. "It is okay," I said softly. "You are safe." Ethan looked toward the door. The laughter came again, this time louder. Without warning, he stood and left the room. I followed him into the hallway. He moved faster than usual, crossing toward the staircase. "Ethan," I called gently. He did not stop. By the time I reached the first floor, he had already disappeared into the crowd of visitors. Panic tightened my chest. The foyer was packed with unfamiliar faces. Conversations overlapped. People moved in every direction. I searched frantically. No sign of him. "Has anyone seen Ethan?" I asked. Nobody answered immediately. My pulse quickened. For the first time since arriving here, genuine fear crept into my thoughts. Then I spotted a small figure near the far end of the ballroom. Ethan stood surrounded by strangers. Several guests smiled politely at him. One woman crouched down, attempting to speak with him. Ethan looked terrified. His breathing appeared shallow. His hands were clenched tightly at his sides. Without thinking, I crossed the room. "There you are." The relief in my voice surprised even me. Ethan turned instantly. The moment he saw me, everything changed. He rushed forward and wrapped both arms around my waist. The entire room seemed to fall silent. Guests stopped talking. Staff members stared openly. Even I froze for a second. Ethan had never done this before. Not once. He held on tightly, burying his face against my side as though I were the only familiar thing left in the world. Then I noticed Damien standing across the room. His eyes widened slightly. Not because Ethan was upset, because Ethan had chosen me. Out of everyone in that crowded mansion, Ethan had reached for me. And judging by the look on Damien's face, that meant far more than I understood. That evening, the mansion felt unusually quiet. The business guests had gone home. The staff moved through the hallways with relieved smiles. Yet I could not stop thinking about what had happened in the ballroom. Ethan had chosen me. Not Mrs. Carter. Not one of the security guards he had known for years. Me. The realization followed me all the way to dinner. Ethan sat beside me at the long dining table, while Damien occupied the chair across from us. Soft light from the chandelier reflected against polished silverware. For once, nobody seemed eager to fill the silence. It felt comfortable, almost peaceful. Ethan slowly pushed peas around his plate, while the repaired music box rested beside him. He carried it everywhere now. At one point, he glanced up and caught me watching him. Instead of looking away, he held my gaze for a second and then returned to eating. Another small victory. After dinner, I helped clear the table. When I returned to the dining room, Ethan was gone. I found him 20 minutes later in the library. He sat curled into a large armchair with a picture book resting open in his lap. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The room smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. I sat in the chair beside him and opened my own book. Neither of us spoke. We simply existed together in the quiet. An hour passed that way, then another. At some point, Ethan fell asleep. The book slid from his lap onto the carpet. I smiled and carefully bent down to retrieve it. That was when I noticed someone standing near the doorway. Damien. He had been watching for several minutes. "He looks peaceful," I whispered. Damien nodded. His eyes remained fixed on his son. I have not seen him fall asleep outside his room since Olivia died. The sadness in his voice was impossible to miss. I looked back at Ethan. His face appeared younger when he slept. Lighter somehow, as if grief loosened its grip for a few precious hours each night. "He is trying," I said softly. "He wants to come back." Damien lowered his gaze. For a moment, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a father carrying an impossible weight. "And what if he cannot?" he asked quietly. "What if this is as far as he gets?" I thought about Ethan handing me the music box, about his tiny smile, about the way he had wrapped his arms around me in the ballroom. "Then we keep showing up anyway," I answered. Something shifted in Damien's expression. Not certainty, not hope, but perhaps the beginning of both. Just then, Ethan stirred in his sleep. His small hand reached blindly across the armrest. Searching. Instinctively, I took it. His fingers closed around mine immediately. The tension left his face. Then it happened. So softly I almost thought I imagined it. A single sleepy word escaped his lips. "Mom." My breath caught. Damien froze. Neither of us moved. Ethan's eyes remained closed. He was still dreaming. Yet tears instantly filled Damien's eyes. For a long moment, the room stood completely still. Then Ethan's fingers tightened around my hand, and his lips moved once more. This time the word was clear. "Grace." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the library windows for the first time in what felt like weeks. I woke to the smell of fresh coffee and the distant sound of laughter. Real laughter. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. Then I heard it again. Small, bright, unmistakable. "Ethan." I followed the sound downstairs and found him in the kitchen sitting beside Mrs. Carter while she baked blueberry muffins. Flour covered his tiny hands. A streak of it rested across the tip of his nose. He looked up when he saw me. For 1 second, his green eyes widened. Then something incredible happened. "Grace." My name. Clear. Soft. Real. The room froze. Mrs. Carter stopped stirring. One of the housekeepers nearly dropped a mixing bowl. Tears instantly filled my eyes. Ethan looked surprised by his own voice, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to use it. Then a small smile spread across his face. "Grace," he repeated, this time stronger. I crossed the room and knelt beside him. "Good morning, Ethan." He laughed. Actually laughed. The sound filled every empty corner of the house. Later that afternoon, we spent hours in the garden beneath the giant oak tree. Ethan talked only a little. A word here, a sentence there. But nobody rushed him. Nobody pushed. Every syllable felt like a gift. As the weeks passed, more words followed. Then conversations. Then stories. The silence that had once surrounded him slowly disappeared. And with it, the sadness that had haunted the mansion for so long began to fade. One evening near the start of spring, Damien found me sitting on the terrace after Ethan had gone to bed. The gardens glowed beneath hundreds of tiny lights. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers through the air. Neither of us spoke immediately. We simply watched the stars appear one by one above the trees. "You changed everything," Damien said quietly. I shook my head. "Ethan did that himself." No, his voice was gentle. "You gave him a reason to try." I looked down at my hands. The same hands that had once scrubbed hotel floors and counted every dollar before buying groceries. It still felt strange to think how close I had come to never accepting this job. "I think he saved me too," I admitted. Damien smiled. The expression transformed his entire face. Then perhaps all three of us were lost. We sat together beneath the stars for a long time after that. Months later, the mansion no longer felt like a place of grief. Music drifted through hallways again. Laughter echoed from room to room. Ethan ran through the gardens with the energy of a child finally learning how to be one. And every evening, before bed, he placed the repaired music box beside his mother's photograph. 1 year after I arrived, I stood at the front window watching snow fall softly across the grounds. Behind me, Ethan was building a block tower while Damien helped him. Their laughter filled the room. Warm. Easy. Home. I thought back to the frightened young woman who had stepped through those gates with $23 in her bank account and nowhere else to go. She had arrived looking for work. Instead, she found a family. Sometimes people believe healing arrives through grand gestures, through dramatic moments that change everything overnight. But I learned something different. Sometimes healing begins with a repaired music box, a shared silence, a small hand reaching for yours. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never expected to need.